Greetings and welcome to 10th Talk. My name is Mike Maharrey with the 10th Amendment Center. On this episode, West Virginia State Delegate Pat McGeehan talks about how states can push back against unconstitutional wars. You'll not only learn about how states can retake control over their National Guard units, you'll also get an inside look at the political maneuvering that goes on behind the scenes in state government and the powerful lobbyists who oppose liberty. Appreciate you taking the time to be here with me, Pat. How are you?
Doing good. Really appreciate being on and the invitation, Mike. Thanks very much.
I'm really excited to talk about this specific piece of legislation that you sponsor because it's one of my favorite things that we've ever tracked at the 10th Amendment Center. And it's interesting because a lot of people buy into this idea of nullification or using state power to kind of push back against federal overreach. They get it when it comes to domestic policy. You know, they can kind of see how you can deal with something like health care or things like that. But a lot of people will say, well, there's no way that the states could ever possibly influence foreign policy, and yet this bill that you sponsored really does exactly that. It was House Bill 2732, known as the Defend the Guard bill. And I'll just let you kind of explain, just give a quick outline of what that bill would have done had it passed.
You know, I'm really, it's my favorite bill. I'm not going to take full credit for the idea. I think I had the idea sort of independent of you guys, but you guys had a framework for the Defend the Guard Act when I started researching it. And so I took that and then talked with some other people to come up with the initial bill. But that was 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, you know, this is an issue I've introduced now in the West Virginia legislature for 5 consecutive years. And the bill is designed to force accountability on Washington, D.C., while also promoting, you know, the adherence to the rule of law, right, constitutionalism, decentralization. And it does all of this, you know, by taking on the most disastrous and atrocious thing the government ultimately does, and that is offensive and unnecessary wars around the globe. And so, you know, I always like to think of, okay, let's rack and stack, you know, the state atrocities in our modern age. And if we do that and rank and order them, number one would be probably murder and offensive war. Mm-hmm. And then somewhere, you know, at the very bottom of that list might be, you know, welfare to orphans or so. Right. So, you know, maybe we should start with the number one disasters first, and that's sort of how I always go about things, and that's why I like this bill, because it does take on the national security state. So all it really says is, to simplify it, is that, you know, the U.S. Congress has to take a vote as required by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which strictly gives the power of war to the Congress. They have to take a vote and declare war before they can send our own boys and girls in our state's Guard units into combat overseas. Because the State Guard, the National Guard as it's known now, mm-hmm, in each state is underneath the governor. The governor is the commander-in-chief of every state's Guard units, unless the federal government activates them and federalizes them, is what they normally say. And so this bill prohibits the federal government from taking control of our state's Guard unless it's done in a constitutional manner, by a declaration of war, or under the Militia Act, as it's called. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 expressly gives 3 different enumerated powers for when the federal government, the U.S. Congress, can federalize the militia, or as it's known now as the National Guard, and that's to repel an invasion, suppress an insurrection, or enforce the laws of the Union. And of course, if the Congress declares war, that would be considered enforcing the law of the Union. Mm-hmm. So those conditions would have to exist before the federal government can take control of our boys and girls and send them into unnecessary, disastrous wars, nation building, and regime changing around the world. So I think that's a very good thing. The executive branch, as I don't have to tell you, has grown far too powerful. It really doesn't matter who the president is anymore.
Right.
Whether it's Trump or Obama or Clinton, because the precedent has even been somewhat set that the president does not even need really authorization from the Congress at all before our boys and girls are sent into wars overseas in foreign nations, which essentially throws out the Constitution completely. I mean, I believe Truman was the first guy after World War II who, by executive fiat, went to war in Korea under the banner of the United Nations and never even consulted the Congress initially. And that precedent has just grown and grown. And so that is a pretty extraordinary claim that technically you don't even need to go to the Congress anymore. But meanwhile, the Congress, does very little to rein in this growth and executive power as well. They don't want to reclaim the power of war, and this is sometimes where I think the founders were brilliant guys. The founders and the framers of the Constitution, they were doing the best they could at the time with what they knew, and some of the things they have transpired since then, they could never really, I don't think, truly project, given that there was this certain, proposition that, well, they were going off Montesquieu and the spirit of the laws and the separation of powers, and they thought, well, if we can create these conditions where each branch is jealous of its own power, then that'll check, ambition will check ambition. But what if, one branch of government wants to take the path of least resistance and not have any responsibility, and then they don't take the blame, and so I think that's kind of what the Congress has done. They said, we'll just give it to the president, and then we don't have to deal with anything, and we could sit back with our $200,000 salaries and plush staff and receptions and actually just do nothing. So that's sort of transpired too, and so the Congress has abdicated its constitutional duty with respect to the power of war. So this bill in particular, the Defend the Guard Act is just rooted in somewhat rooted in nullification or interposition, which is, of course, I don't have to tell you this, but it's with Thomas Jefferson's idea that, when you're faced with a federal government that acts like it has no limits, someone has to limit it, and you just can't expect it to limit itself. And Jefferson, along with Madison, set out in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 and made some very good historical, logical, legal arguments that the bodies that have to limit the federal government when it does go above and beyond what's constitutionally mandated are the states themselves. The state legislatures must refuse to go along with unconstitutional measures and get in between this out of control federal government and the citizens. And so that's sort of the bill in a nutshell. And the thing I like about the bill is that it can be effective if you have committed state representatives to this idea, and all you would really need is 4 or 5, maybe 6 different states to start implementing this idea, and then it could be really effective. And we can get into that a little bit more about why I kind of suspect that it is a good idea, just based on the reaction that I have seen from the brass and the Pentagon and the national, the general, the Adjutant General of the West Virginia National Guard. I mean, you would think the world was coming to an end that I'm even proposing such a thing. So that's when you kind of know, you're onto something.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
yeah, I definitely want to get into that in just a second. Before I do, I want you to give the audience a little bit of your background, because they might be sitting here thinking, oh, well, this is some left winger, some peacenik or something, and I mean, you have a little bit of experience as far as the military goes, right?
Yeah, I come from a military family. I was fortunate enough to gain an appointment to the U.S. Air Force Academy, mm-hmm. which is in Colorado Springs, and that's when I did my 4 years of hell. I mean, college. And so then 9/11 actually hit my junior year at the academy out there. And I always wanted to be. We had this conversation actually. I always wanted to be a mm-hmm. fighter pilot, and the fighter pilots, they get the glamour and everything. Right. But after 9/11 hit, they asked for volunteers to go into the intelligence service, and so I was chosen to do that just based on a number of factors. So I was an intelligence officer after I graduated from the Air Force Academy, and I did some time overseas, mainly in the Middle East, in Qatar, at Al Udeid Air Base as an analyst for the senior ranking Air Force General in theater. And then, but I also did some service over in Afghanistan at Bagram Air Base. And this was in 2005. And then, my father was a career Air Force officer. He was a B-52 bomber pilot. So I was raised following him around during the 80s, during the Cold War, right. From base to base. During he would always say the glory of the SAC days, Strategic Air Command. Mm. And it's funny because our favorite movie together when I was a kid, he was killed. His bomber went down. In '94, actually, he was killed in an aircraft accident. But when I was 14. But anyway, that's another story. Our favorite movie was Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah.
We always used, Slim Pickens riding the bomb mm-hmm. down. So we always used to watch that together and just joke around about how, exaggerated some of the claims of the missile gap and the aircraft gap and everything on both sides were during the Cold War.
Right.
So, but he was very much a scholar. He taught me, the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth. He was a very honorable man. He believed in integrity to the end. There's nothing more a man needs to pursue than of course God, but principle above all things, and I learned a lot from him. And I remember distinctly, after the first Gulf War and Desert Storm, I was in his library and I was his den, and I was mm-hmm. we had a conversation. I might have been like 13 at the time. And I remember distinctly asking him, Dad, why didn't we just go into Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein and just finish the job? Something to that respect. And I remember him telling me, he was a major at the time, I think maybe a light colonel and a lieutenant colonel. Mm-hmm. And he said, we never should have gotten involved in the first place. He said it's a quagmire. Different factions have been fighting there for centuries, and we don't understand their culture. And it was the right decision to at least get out while we still could. But it always stuck in my mind because that was not the answer I thought he was going to give. So he was very much someone who wanted to pursue the truth. And so he taught me a lot, but his dad, my grandfather, was fought in World War II in the European theater. My grandfather on my mother's side was a gunner on a naval destroyer in the Pacific, and actually witnessed the surrender of the Japanese on board the USS Missouri, in Tokyo. And my great grandfather on my dad's side fought in the First World War. So. and then numbers of others, extended relatives, were served in the military. So, I've got a proud military background, I think, with my family, but I've also learned a lot of lessons from my own service and from my father, and so just because you don't want to go to war, or just because you're you believe that you should never fight unjust wars, and you should be critical about politicians, sending us the boys and girls into war, has no bearing on your patriotism whatsoever. And my family's very much Catholic, probably due to my Irish heritage. My full name is Patrick Riley McGeehan. So we have a rich intellectual tradition in the church, and so my dad and myself, he taught me a lot about St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the great theologians in the Catholic Church, and the man who in the 13th century was really credited with fully developing just war theory, and taught me a lot about that. And I really, if you apply Aquinas' just war theory, I really don't think that any conflict or war since the Second World War would really meet all the different criteria. So anyway, so that's sort of my background, I guess, from a military point of view and otherwise.
Yeah. It's interesting because my grandfather and I had almost the exact same conversation as you and your dad, although our conversation was about Vietnam. My grandfather was an Army officer. He went in right at the beginning of the First World War as a Green infantryman, and served all the way up through the end of Vietnam, and came out as a full colonel. And we had, I remember sitting at lunch and asking questions about Vietnam, and he had that same thing. In fact, that's why he got out of the Army. He was on track to become a general, and he said he just couldn't deal with it after the ridiculous, and some of the exact same things you said. He said, we don't understand the culture. It's a quagmire. These people fighting each other for, it's interesting how those patterns of history kind of tend to repeat themselves. So let's circle back to the Defend the Guard bill, because I think the process that it went through is interesting. In the first place, I was really surprised when I saw that the first committee it was in, which was, I believe, Foreign Affairs, something like that.
Veterans
Affairs, yeah. That it passed that, and then it went to the Justice Committee, and then things got kind of interesting. You had to do a little bit of politicking there to kind of talk about that, because I think people would be interested in knowing what goes on behind the scenes to really to get a bill to move.
Okay, so this is going to be a little bit inside baseball, parliamentary procedure, and that kind of thing. But I'm sure your audience is let's just say above the bell curve, or have far let's just say high IQs. Okay.
Right.
So,
and we talk a lot about the legislative process and how important it is to be tuned in to committees and these types of things, just in terms of making phone calls and whatnot. So this will help people understand how, their input into the process. It's more than just calling your representative when it's on the House floor. So this will give a good insight into that.
Okay. Excellent. So, like I said, I've introduced this bill for 5 years. The very first year is when Republicans took control of the state legislature in West Virginia.
Right.
It's been, in the hands of Democrats for decades.
That's very similar to Kentucky.
Yeah, exactly. So I introduced the bill, and that's the first year in 2015 that it actually made some progress. I got it onto the agenda in the Veterans Affairs and Homeland Security. That's the long title for this committee. I got it on the agenda because I happen to be the vice chair of that committee. And a number of Republicans and some Democrats wanted to co-sponsor the bill. and it was loaded up and with co-sponsors, but they didn't, I don't think, completely understand just how just how large of a deviation from the status quo it was.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it got on the agenda, and then of course the Adjutant General 2-star of the West Virginia National Guard got wind of it, and there was a big meeting before the committee meeting in the Speaker of the House's office with myself and a few of guys in the Liberty Caucus that we had sort of formed in the Republican Party. Guys that are sort of liberty oriented, who were co-sponsoring the bill with me, and the Adjutant General, who's in uniform, and that's kind of weird. I don't care for military guys walking around a civilian legislature in battle dress uniform and camouflage. It's just kind of weird. I don't know.
Kind of an eye roll.
Yeah. It's like a Few Good Men scene.
Right.
Like, he's like a Jack Nicholson type. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. But so we had this meeting. This is back in 2015, and the Adjutant General said, "I really agree with the bill," and he started tearing up because he said he had lost, I think, a couple guys in Afghanistan, but he just can't go along with it because the Pentagon. And I believe he said at the time that the Chief of Staff of the Army, I believe, had called him and said, "Hey, that bill has to die," and I believe he said that they would just move some of our Guard units into different states or put some of our National Guard bases on the BRAC list, which is, for all intents and purposes, closing the base. That's what that means. But I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, that's what he said, and it was a fear tactic. And the Speaker of the House, who really liked the bill at first, said, well, okay, we can't do that, obviously. Sorry, Pat. And I go, well, I'm going to try to run it anyway. So, I didn't get very far. So that was the end of that. That's as far as it made it. Every year since then, it hasn't done anything until this year, because this year we had a change in leadership. The Speaker of the House, who was in that initial meeting back in 2015, he resigned and was appointed by the governor to be on the state Supreme Court as a justice. And so now we have a new Republican Speaker of the House, and he's about my age. He's, I'll be 40 later this year, so he's about my age. And he was sort of a friend. He wasn't exactly a liberty kind of guy, but he was reasonable and logical, and we could see eye to eye on some things. That's what I thought. So I thought there was a chance. So I'd been talking with him several times, starting before Christmas, all the way up until January, when the regular session for this year started in West Virginia. And our legislative sessions last a little over 60 days, and then we have special sessions throughout the year. Right. So I said, hey, listen, I just want to vote on my Defend the Guard bill, Defend the Guard Act. I want a full vote on the House floor and a debate on the issue. Open debate. Okay, if it passes or not, let's do it on the merits. I'll argue it. And if you even want to come down off the podium and argue against it, if you want to, fine, I'll take you on. But let's just, no direction. Don't try to steer anybody in any way. Just up or down vote. And he gave me indications that, okay, well, we can do that. When time went on, and oh, by the way, he made me the chairman of the Veterans Affairs and Homeland Security Committee. So I'm actually the chairman, and that's where the bill was referenced. Right. And he also indicated that it was only going to be single reference. Now, if the Speaker has, when you introduce a bill, he has usually the discretion. I don't know if it's like this in every state.
It is. It is, okay. For sure.
Okay, so he has the discretion to reference a bill to whatever committee he wants that bill to go to. And normally it'll go to a committee that is in the same sort of category as that sort of issue, right? So he referenced it. Obviously, it's dealing with veterans and military affairs, so he referenced it to my committee. Well, he had indicated it was only going to be single referenced. Because if you reference it to multiple committees, then obviously it can be a sign that the leadership or the speaker does not want it to pass.
Right.
It's
kind of burying it.
Right. It's like burying it in paperwork or just trying to kill it off. So he did double reference it. So it came to my committee first, and then he referenced it to the Judiciary Committee after that. And at the time, I was actually on the Judiciary Committee. So I said, okay, well, maybe I could get it through. I'll talk to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee after I get it out of Veterans, and we'll get this thing out. Well, I got it out of the Veterans Committee, and it went to Judiciary, and then I got kicked off the Judiciary Committee. And that's the second time I've gotten kicked off or out of something, actually, in the last 4 or 5 years in the legislature. And I always tell people, look, if I'm not getting kicked out of something or excluded from a meeting, I'm probably not doing my job.
I was just thinking that you're probably doing something right if you're rattling people enough for them to start kicking you off of things.
I always say, look, they're not going to kick someone that's not effective off a committee. So if you impede the established agenda, you can expect to sometimes be removed. But it usually backfires on them. So anyway, for some other reason, I got in the way of this other bill that I felt was unconstitutional. It died, and it was a big agenda piece. And so they kicked me off the Judiciary Committee. So I basically said, well, you know what? I got nothing to do right now because I'm off this major committee. So I'm just going to have to move to do something a little bit more unconventional. And it's called one of these moves that's unconventional, which is the one I pursued, is called a discharge motion. And basically, you, from the House floor, when you convene every day on the House floor to conduct parliamentary business, you, under motions, under the order of business, you can move to discharge a bill that's been sitting in a committee and that you think the chairman of the committee is never going to put on the agenda to be taken up for debate. You can move to circumvent that process and bring the bill directly to the House floor to debate and vote and just skip the committee process. So that's what I ended up doing, and that was on a Friday. And they always say, by the way, the leadership always says you have to turn in any motions you want to do ahead of time in writing. And they do that because they want to make sure they have control, and that's kind of tipping your hand and giving up the element of surprise. So I didn't do that. So I just waited until the speaker was running through the order of business, and he got to motions. And normally that's just a standard type of run through the order of business action. And he got to motions, and then, we have a recognition button. I hit my button to be recognized, and he kind of looked up and said, gentleman from the first, why do you seek to be recognized? And I stood up, and I started trying to fit as much speech into the motion as I could, because normally they can cut you off and if you're out of order. And anyway, so I moved to discharge the bill, and it was pretty incredible. The vote was I failed within 2 votes, 47 to 45, I believe, was the vote. So I came within 2 votes, but there was 4 people missing. There's 100 state delegates in the West Virginia House. Yep. There's 4 people missing, and I was pretty shocked, actually. I was like, wow, that almost worked.
Yeah, I remember that afternoon, Bolden sent me an email. He was like, McGeehan almost got that discharged, and he said, I think he's going to try again. So we were pretty excited when we heard that.
And it wasn't a surprise either. After that, the media wanted to talk to me, and I just told the press, yeah, I think I'm going to try on Monday. That was on a Friday, so give the weekend. I was like, there's 4 guys missing. I'll probably try again Monday morning.
Mm-hmm.
So they definitely had to have known it was coming. So I went in and then did the same thing on Monday morning, and I mean, it passed. I mean, and I actually gained votes.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the 4 guys that were missing, but more. And so I think the vote was like 56 to 40 something anyway. So it was discharged, and it got brought to the House floor for first reading. And in West Virginia, you have to have a bill lay on the House floor for 3 consecutive days until you have the final vote.
Right.
It's just a measure in the state constitution to make sure that everybody, nothing's rushed too much and everybody has time to read it and things like that. So I was, oh wow, it's crazy. Well, this whole time so that's what I did. That was the kind of the successful part of it. But then other forces started kind of getting involved, and that's sort of what happened next, and that was very disappointing. And so I could go into that too.
Well, yeah, definitely. I was going to say, why don't you go ahead and get into that, because I think it gives a lot of insight into just what happens when you start trying to buck the establishment and the way things are done. And I mean, I'll say this too, just up front. This is a specific story, but this happens on all kinds of legislation. I mean, we've seen this with things relating to surveillance, anything where you have police involved, you get this kind of back channel, things get killed that look good in 1 minute. So I think this is a really good object lesson to the powers that are kind of behind the scenes on a lot of this type of stuff.
Yeah, you're going to when you take on something like this that strikes at the heart of the national security state, or say anything. You mentioned the police, law enforcement, civil asset forfeiture reform, things of that nature. That those elements of the government are, in some respects, the most powerful elements of the government, because, of course, they have the power to kill, to seize property, to search your private possessions, your private home. I mean, there's a lot of power to jail you. I mean, there's a lot of power there that you're starting to really tamper with, and I think that's why you get a little pushback if you're starting to threaten any of that power, because, most of the time people don't want to just give up power willingly.
Nope.
So what happened was the first time I went for the discharge motion was on a Friday morning, and immediately the Adjutant General of the National Guard, 2-star general, brought in his guys into the State House afterwards, and they were all wearing their battle dress uniform. And for those not familiar with that, it's just camouflage. We call them utilities, and you're really supposed
BTUs, I think, was the old term that they used to use.
BTUs was the old, you really, if you're going to show up at the Capitol in the military off base, you're supposed to show up in a tie, a service dress uniform. Right. These guys are trying to make a statement, so they show up, and some of my colleagues told me that they had come into their office and were sort of trying to be a little bit more intimidating, saying you can't vote for this again. I've got it secondhand that they sort of barged into the Speaker of the House's office. And then, there was definitely text messages being sent to state reps from the Adjutant General directly that I was being shown by Democrats and Republicans, because I had half the co-sponsors were Democrats, the other half were Republicans on this bill. I mean, it was definitely a bipartisan bill, and it was loaded up. We can have, I think, 12 maximum. That's the rule in West Virginia. You can have 12 co-sponsors on the bill, and I had 6 and 6 from each party. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So there was phone calls being made. The Adjutant General kind of, I think, learned that might as well not even talk with me about it. But he did have the head enlisted member of the West Virginia National Guard give me a call, an E9, and we had a good chat. And I just said, hey, look, you're not going to change my mind on this. And I don't know if General Hoyer, that's the guy's name, puts you up to this, but I'm moving forward with this, and I'm going to try to do it again on Monday. And so it passed on Monday. The discharge motion carried. Right. Well, then the next day on Tuesday, the Adjutant General was at the Pentagon, by the way, the next week, and when it passed, he was making phone calls, and he got the speaker, along with the Democrat minority leader, there's a back room sort of committee called the Rules Committee,
right.
and essentially what they did is, after it passed and got put on first reading, the Rules Committee, which is just stacked with yes men for leadership, moved it off the active calendar, so it was no longer really on the agenda, into this thing called the inactive calendar, sort of behind closed doors, and that's it. And so, I confronted the speaker about it. He whipped out his cell phone and showed me text messages from the minority leader talking about how, the general was blowing his phone up, and was talking about how the general was texting the speaker as well, and and I think there were some other guys from the Pentagon involved as well, and it really just goes to show you that if a professional officer, especially a flag officer like a general, is supposed to serve the state and serve the public, not dictate the state's policy.
Right.
And I really feel that these guys went out of their way to undermine a civilian legislature, and that's a dangerous thing. That really is that's the kind of thing you would expect in some sort of banana republic, and it was really sickening to me, because they threw out their oath of office, in my opinion. They justified it by all sorts of different reasons. It depends on what state rep you talk to and what they told them. But, they would tell one guy, well, we'll lose all this federal funding. Or they'll tell another guy, hey, we're not going to be able to do this important mission overseas. Or, just all sorts of straw man, red herring arguments that are thrown out. The real reason is because a combination of things. I do think the Adjutant General of the West Virginia National Guard listens to some brass at the Pentagon, and he also fancies himself as some sort of Captain America, where he has to go around and pursue this adventurism around the globe,
right,
and do all these cool things with all these units he has. And he has a bunch of special forces units in West Virginia and our guard units, and those guys he's constantly deploying to who knows where around the globe. And this bill would obviously get in the way of that.
Yeah.
So there's, and it's difficult to go after a guy who's in uniform, because of the way that a lot of the public sees the military now. But I want to make a distinction here. By and large, the rank and file guardsmen in my state completely support this bill.
Yeah, I'm sure they do.
It's only the brass that hate it. So and I just feel that they can't attack me as being some sort of hippie who just, doesn't care about defense and is siding with the terrorists or whatever, because, I think that would be foolhardy if they did. So anyway.
there's a couple of things that come to mind as I'm listening to this. The first thing, just kind of going to your point about the rank and file. I've got a good friend that's in the Kentucky National Guard. He's out now, but he was, and they got deployed a couple of years ago to someplace in Africa. And I'm thinking, why is the Kentucky National Guard going to Africa? And he was asking the same question, and he definitely communicated to me that there's that sentiment. We see our mission as a defensive mission, not to go run around and try to extend U.S. power into Africa of all places. The other thing that's interesting is that you may be aware that we had a piece of legislation several years ago that was aimed at the NSA. To basically turn off the water at the NSA facility in Bluffdale, Utah.
I met the state rep that led that bill.
Yeah. Well, he had a very similar experience in terms of gaining a lot of support within the state legislature, a whole lot of support in the grassroots. So it's kind of a deal where it went into a committee. Instead of killing the bill in the committee, they held it over for study. So it went to a study committee, which required them to have a public hearing over the summer. The public hearing was a huge success, very well attended, a lot of support for the legislation. When it came to the next year, in Utah, the way their process works is all bills go to the Rules Committee, and then the Rules Committee, they distribute the bills to the various standing committees. So it was in Rules, and a very similar story with the commander of the Utah National Guard coming in and individually pressuring members of that committee and basically saying, you're not going to release this to the process. And not only him, from what I understand, there were also overtures made by the state's U.S. congressional delegation and whatnot. But the general of their National Guard was very much involved in making sure that bill did not get in the process. So, again, it's interesting because this is a specific story to West Virginia, but this repeats itself all over the place, and to a lesser degree, like I said, with bills, anything that's involving law enforcement, surveillance, asset forfeiture, police militarization, those types of things, you get very intense pressure from, as you say, people who are very difficult to resist because of the public perception. So I really appreciate you sharing kind of your experience with that, and I just want to say thank you for your willingness to do that work, because I see so many bills that are really good bills that get introduced, and then the legislators don't really do anything to push them forward. It takes a lot of work to move a bill, and so you're a huge asset to the folks in West Virginia.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll just add real quick. It's been my experience that sometimes you got to be careful, because some politicians will introduce a bill to satisfy a base, and all they'll do is say, "Hey, I introduced that bill." I did this, yeah. And by the same token, they're telling leadership, "Oh, don't worry, I don't really buy into that. I'm just introducing this bill just because I want the votes from this particular group." So I've seen that happen time and time again. So
yeah, it's interesting from our perspective. Like I said, I told you before, I've been doing this for almost 10 years now. So I've seen a lot of bills in a lot of state legislatures, and you start to know those representatives that are just introducing those bills for for the show and for the press release, and then they don't ever lift a finger to work those through the system, and that's a shame, but it's the world we live in. So
you're right.
I was actually going to get a little bit into sound money, because that's an area that you've also been involved in, but I think I'm going to skip that just because this doesn't go for an hour or 2 hours or so. I'm sure we could sit here and talk all day. Maybe I'll have you back on here in the near future, and we can talk a little bit about sound money. Sure. I want to let people know you have written a book called "Printing Our Way to Poverty: The Consequences of American Inflation," and we can have a long conversation on that. My my job where I earn my money is actually with Shift Gold. So I'm
really?
I'm real involved in doing a lot of writing on Federal Reserve and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So,
I'm a big fan of Peter Schiff. So
yeah, Peter's amazing. I do want to touch on one other thing just before I let you go. Another book that you've written that this is just something that's personally interesting to me. It's called Stoicism in the State House, an old philosophy serving a new idea. And I'm really interested in this because I think it, from what I understand, and I'll give the caveat that I've not actually read the book, but I've read some interviews and have a general idea of where it's coming from. But the whole idea of Stoicism, I know, is something that has been a powerful tool for you in being able to kind of stand up and take these tough stands and deal with the pressure that comes from, sometimes doing the unpopular thing and being willing to get kicked off of a committee and stuff. So can you give just like a real quick overview of what that book is about and how it can kind of be of value to maybe other people who are out there and involved in the world of politics or even just in their day-to-day life?
Yeah, no problem. I wrote that book. It's a little under 200 pages, and it was published in the middle of 2017. And the target audience was sort of the liberty-oriented state legislature, or congressman, or anybody in an elected assembly, really. That was the target audience who sort of sympathized with our limited government views. But anybody who's looking to sort of overcome problems in their life or gain a fuller understanding on how to live a better life can probably get something out of it regardless. But Stoicism, is of course an ancient philosophy that was founded in Athens by a guy named Zeno of Citium in about 300 BC. And the early Stoics after Zeno were Cleanthes and then Chrysippus. He was the authority on early Stoicism. We don't have much of what he wrote anymore, but the more widely known Stoic philosophical pieces of literature would certainly be Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and then Epictetus too. Epictetus is sort of my favorite Stoic philosopher.
That's the one I've read.
Okay, yeah. He there's a small little book his student Arian put out, which is just an excerpt from lectures. That called the Enchiridion, and it's really that translates into manual or handbook, and many famous individuals from history used to carry that book around, and so I was first exposed to Stoicism as a freshman at the U.S. Air Force Academy, actually. By a guy named James Stockdale. Jim Stockdale. Most people would probably know of Admiral Stockdale if they remember the 1992 election season. Stockdale reluctantly accepted Ross Perot's request to be his running mate. So Stockdale was Ross Perot's vice presidential running mate. And it's unfortunate because anybody that might be familiar with him is probably just best familiar with the short Saturday Night Live skit, that Dana Carvey did with I can't remember the other guy's name, making fun of Stockdale because at the beginning of the lone vice presidential debate of that season in '92, where Stockdale was on stage with Quayle and Al Gore, I believe.
I think that's right.
It was Al Gore, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, Stockdale opens up with, who am I? Why am I here? And everybody just thought he was sort of just, some sort of, he was off because
Stockdale spent 7.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. He was shot down over North Vietnam. He was a Naval Academy graduate, went to Stanford, got a graduate degree from there, but, flew fighters during the Vietnam War, was shot down and, was brutally tortured by the Vietnamese, but he was a senior ranking naval officer in the Hanoi Hilton. And while he was at Stanford, he wandered into the Stanford philosophy department, and the dean of the philosophy department sort of turned him on to Stoicism, and he adopted it. And just so happened that that happened before, of course, he got deployed to Vietnam, and he credited Stoicism, and in particular Epictetus, from allowing him to overcome the adversity of being a prisoner of war. And Stockdale spent 4 years in solitary confinement of that 7.5 years in leg irons, being heavily tortured. And so I had a chance to meet James Stockdale. He showed up my freshman year to give a lecture on character. And I had known about him ahead of time from my dad. He was a hero of my dad's growing up and told me about him. And and then I had a philosophy class at the academy just later that year, and it talked about Stockdale's adoption of Stoicism. And so anyway, fast forward, 20 years or so in my early 30s, and I started coming across some of the Stoics, and I decided to try to kind of adopt a lot of their philosophy in my own personal way of life. And that's why I finally started to write. I wrote the book about it because, it really comes down to, it's called the dichotomy of control, and what you can control and what you cannot control, and only focus on what you can control, and dismiss what you can't control. And really what you have complete control over is a very limited amount of things, and just basically your mind, your thoughts, your opinions, your desires, and ultimately your actions from those. And if you can do that, you can really overcome a lot of adversity. But the Stoics also talk really about pursuing virtue, and then implementing the dichotomy of control to allow you to pursue virtue more. And the 4 cardinal virtues they talk about, and all the classical philosophical schools really talk about, except for maybe the Epicureans, is the courage, temperance or self-control, justice, and wisdom. And courage, I think, is probably the most important, especially when you're in the state legislature, because in the state legislature, it's much more personal than maybe Washington, D.C., because if you're a congressman or a senator, you have so many staffers around you, and you're buffered. You're buffered. You don't have to ride the elevator with your colleagues. And in the state legislature, you're sharing an office with one guy, maybe 2 guys. You don't really have a staff. You might have an intern. You're walking down the hallway, and you're with the guys that might hate your guts for what you're about to do, and there's very personal confrontations that you have to deal with. And so how do you keep your sanity, and how do you stay on track? How do you not give into the dark side, right? You have to try to dismiss the insults. Don't fall into that trap. Beware of the negative passions. The Stoics always talk about, stay away from anger, stay away from, fear, anger, aggression. These are the ways of the dark side, to quote Star Wars. The sort of the whole Jedi character was developed really on the Stoic philosophy. And my little girl's in Star Wars, so anyway.
Well, that came out in I was about 10 when the first movie came out, so that was like big formative cultural event for me, Star Wars. Because I was the first 3 movies I was all in, and it's been kind of neat because now, fast forward, my son he just started college this year, but it's been cool to kind of share bridges our two generations.
It is
pretty cool.
kind of neat. Yeah, I was disappointed in the last one, but hey, a little too much nihilism in the last one for me, but it's okay. But yeah, the Stoics taught to live according to nature, and the Stoics, when they use the term nature, it's not used in the same connotation we would use it today in modern English. Nature to them was something's highest perfection or highest amount of flourishing, and for man that is reason, because that's sort of what separates men and women from beasts. And so live according to reason is what they're really talking about. So rationality, and so always sort of control your emotions, and they're not talking about repressing emotion. They're talking about preventing the generation of these negative emotions to begin with. And that's to basically change your thought patterns. But anyway, if you can do that, you can more easily exemplify the virtues and do what must be done. So that's what I sort of put in the book. There's about 20 different categories of advice that I sort of give in the Stoic tradition, on particularly with reference to things that are going to happen to you or that you're going to be faced with in a legislative setting. And then the first part of the book is just sort of explaining the Stoic philosophy. But the middle section is about Cato the Younger, probably one of the greatest statesmen from ancient Rome. And he lived in the 1st century BC and was, friends with Cicero, and was basically the arch enemy of Julius Caesar for his entire life. And so it goes into the fall of the Roman Republic, but it's centered around Cato the Younger's life, because Cato the Younger adopted the Stoic philosophy, and there's a lot of examples in his life on how to how to live that. So a lot of people like the middle section for the way I tell the story of the decline of and fall of the Roman Republic. But for liberty-oriented people, or people that just want to learn more about the philosophy, the last section's pretty good, I think. So that's sort of the gist of it, and it's helped me stay the course, while at the same time not allowing myself to become bitter and angry at other people just because they have different opinions, and they might think that, I don't know why this guy's doing this. Why is he doing this to me? He's put me on the record. Why is this guy, I can't stand this guy, or I hate him, or they lose their cool and they blow up on you. If you stick to some of these principles, you could always respond in a rational manner, and you won't fall victim to losing your temper, or it also you can conquer your fear and make sure that you do what you need to do. So.
Yeah. I think that's. I think anybody that's involved in the liberty movement, as they call it, I think that's valuable life lessons in there, because we are of a minority point of view, and we get flack from both sides of the aisle, so to speak. And sometimes it is hard to hold that course. You've got sometimes you just like to sit down to a nice dinner and be able to agree with everybody, and you can't, because we've embraced. I think the truth. So, but I appreciate that. I just, like I said, I kind of wanted to touch on that.
There's a famous quote from Lord Acton, one of my favorite English Catholic philosophers, who's, throughout history, sincere friends of liberty have been rare, but and their triumphs have been due to minorities. And so there's very much some truth to that. If you stick to your guns and you go through the ordeal, even if you're going to lose friends, they're not really your true friends anyway. They can't see what you're doing. You can still affect a whole lot of change even though, you're highly in the minority, even if you're just one person.
Yep,
so
absolutely. Well, and with that, I will thank you for being a friend of the 10th Amendment Center, because that's, we're definitely, that's definitely kind of the role our organization takes. I think we make everybody mad pretty much all the time. So the whole concept of sticking to the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses, that sometimes it tends to ruffle feathers on all sides of the political spectrum. But, that's supposed to be the highest law of the land. So that's what we're going to do. And we appreciate the work that you're doing. And like I said, I'd like to have you back on at some point in the near future. We'll talk a little bit about sound money and gold and silver and the Federal Reserve and those types of things. I think that'd be a good discussion as well. Sure. I appreciate you taking the time.
And no problem. I appreciate it very much, Mike. So thanks again. And tell everybody at the 10th Amendment Center I said hi. And, God bless you.
You too. Thank you.
All right.
That wraps up this episode of 10th Talk. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day to listen to the show. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and consider leaving a comment with your thoughts on what Pat had to say. I thought his insights into the inner workings of the legislative process and the fact that we can actually use state power to push back against the warfare state were fascinating. Thanks again for joining me. We'll see you in the next episode.